For centuries, the death of a pope was always a moment that silenced crowds, interrupted routines, and made the world stop, even for a moment, to reflect on eternity, power, and human fragility. But the death of Pope Francis carries something more, not only because of the man he was, but because of the moment he left. While millions of Christians around the planet celebrated Holy Week, remembering the suffering, cross, and resurrection of Jesus, the man who spiritually led this same crowd took his last breaths. A spiritual leader said goodbye just as the Christian world was reliving the greatest mystery of its faith. And this did not go unnoticed. To follow more stories that unite faith, history, and meaning with depth and respect, subscribe to the channel. Here, every detail matters, and each narrative is constructed to awaken what is truest in your spiritual journey. Francis was not just a pope. He was a living symbol of a church in search of reconciliation, simplicity, and mercy. From the first moments of his pontificate, when he refused golden ornaments and asked for prayers in silence before an ecstatic St. Peter's Square, there was a message in him that went beyond words. His stooped figure, austere countenance, and voice tired over the years spoke for themselves. Here was a servant, not a monarch. And perhaps that's why his death at the end of Holy Week had such an impact. Because, for many, it seemed more than a fact. It sounded like a kind of symbolic response, like an echo between heaven and earth. While the faithful remembered Judas' betrayal, the heavy cross on Christ's shoulders, and the sepulchral silence of Holy Saturday, Francis, already weakened, remained firm until the end of his mission. On Resurrection Sunday, even with his body visibly weakened, he still appeared publicly to offer the traditional Urbi et Orbi blessing to the city of Rome and the world. His gestures were slow, his breathing short, but there he was in front of the crowd, carrying out what seemed to be his last act as a pastor. And it was. Less than 24 hours later, the Vatican would announce his death. What was going through the minds of those who watched it that Sunday? How many realized that they were witnessing the farewell of a pope? There were no dramatic announcements. There were no major warnings about his health that morning. And yet, the image of an exhausted man, sustained by his faith, conveyed more than 1,000 speeches. He blessed, raised his eyes, smiled discreetly, and then silence enveloped him. It was as if he was already at peace with the end. There were many who saw this as a sign. The death of a pontiff is already a rare event full of symbolism. But when it happens on Christianity's holiest days, it becomes almost impossible not to look for some deeper meaning. Was it just a coincidence, a matter of timing, or was there something beyond human understanding involved? This question has no simple answer, but it has resonated in the hearts of millions. This is not the first time that heaven and earth seem to align in events that surpass logic. And yet, even in the midst of the mystery, something stood out clearly. The time in which Francisco left was not just any time. It was a holy time, a time of death and resurrection, a time where the Christian faith finds its deepest foundation in the certainty that the cross is never the end. And perhaps, for this very reason, the departure of a pope during Holy Week was felt as more than mourning. It was experienced as a message. The Christian faith has always been built on symbols that go beyond words. Since the first centuries, the community of believers has understood that God also speaks through time, gestures, and events that mark human history. This is why dates, rituals, and memories have become an essential part of the spiritual experience. Within this context, Holy Week occupies an absolutely prominent place, not only because it remembers the last days of Jesus, but because it is the center around which the entire Christian faith gravitates. It is the period in which the climax of Christ's life is remembered, his surrender, his pain, his death, and the victory over death. A succession of days that, for millions, are not mere liturgical dates, but open doors to eternal mysteries. Understanding the impact of Pope Francis' death requires, first, understanding what Holy Week represents. It is not a simple historical memory, but a symbolic and spiritual update of the events that transformed the world. Palm Sunday recalls Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, acclaimed as king, but riding on a donkey as a sign of humility. On Thursday, the final supper is relived when a master washed the feet of his disciples and instituted the Eucharist. In the sixth, silence and pain are imposed. Christ is betrayed, humiliated, crucified. Holy Saturday is the day of mourning, of the grave, of absence. And then, with the dawn of Easter Sunday, hope explodes. Life has won. The tomb is empty. The world will never be the same. It is in this scenario that the figure of the Pope appears. Since Peter's first successors, the Bishop of Rome has assumed the role of being a point of unity and guide for Christians spread across the continents. The Pope is not just an institutional leader, but a spiritual reference. He is called Servant of Servants, precisely because of his mission to shepherd, console, correct, and represent Christ on earth. Papal authority, even though it has been marked by conflicts, reforms, and even scandals over the centuries, has always carried immense symbolic weight. And this makes the death of a pope an event that transcends politics or religious bureaucracy. Francisco, more than others before him, carried this symbolic dimension with strength. First Pope of Latin America, first Jesuit to occupy the throne of Peter, and, from the beginning, a silent reformer, more concerned with mercy than structure. He spoke directly, avoided titles, preferred the poor to palaces. His encyclicals dealt with human dignity, creation, compassion. And for all this, his departure precisely during the days when Christians relive the suffering and glory of Christ gained an even denser layer of meaning. Those who look at faith sensitively realize that certain events are not random. The Pope could have left at any time of the year, but it was exactly between Easter Sunday and the octave of the resurrection that he breathed his last. A week in which the Church sings of the victory of life over death. A week in which biblical readings at Masses speak of the encounters between the resurrected Jesus and his disciples, of fear transformed into courage, of sadness transfigured into joy. And in that same period, the world received news of the departure of a pastor who, until the end, insisted on announcing hope. This overlapping of events awakens something almost intuitive in those who watch all this, as if there was a harmony hidden in the details, as if Francisco's farewell had not been accidental, but providential, not as something planned or theatrical, but as one of those synchronicities that faith does not try to explain, it only contemplates. The time of death has once again become the time of life, and the silence of a leader echoed along with the Easter announcement. He is no longer here. He is resurrected. The day before Pope Francis' death was marked by a scene that now seems full of farewell. On the central balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, in front of thousands of faithful and cameras spread across the world, he appeared to give his last public blessing. It was Resurrection Sunday, apex of Holy Week. The square was full. The sun touched the ancient marbles, and, in the midst of the most hopeful celebration of Christianity, the pontiff's face showed tiredness. His gestures were slow, his voice almost erased by time. Still, he was there. It was an image that combined fragility, strength, tiredness, and mission accomplished. As if, even knowing his departure was near, Francisco was determined to end his journey doing what he always did, serving. A few hours later, the mood in the Vatican changed drastically. The next morning, when many were still savoring the echo of the Easter liturgy, the city's bells began to ring differently. It was not a liturgical announcement, but a call to silence. The Holy See disclosed a brief note, informing that Pope Francis had passed away at around 7 o'clock in the morning at Casa Santa Marta, the residence he chose to live in since the beginning of his pontificate. The news spread quickly. Newspapers interrupted broadcasts. Agencies released headlines. World leaders spoke out. And in the eyes of the faithful, perplexity was mixed with reverence. There was mourning, but there was also something else. A kind of melancholy peace. It was not a sudden death. Francisco had been facing health problems for years. Old lung problems, mobility difficulties, discreet hospitalizations. Still, whenever he appeared in public, he made a point of keeping his style direct and close. He never demonstrated weakness as a lament, but as part of the journey. Even in his last homilies, he insisted on themes such as hope, mercy, and faithfulness until the end. His final Easter message centered on peace, a word he repeated frequently throughout his pontificate. And, ironically or providentially, he left enveloped in that same spirit. Casa Santa Marta, where he lived and died, also carries symbolism. Unlike the Apostolic Palace, with its halls and tradition of pomp, the residence chosen by Francisco was simple, functional, and discreet. He refused the pontifical apartments to stay in a common space, where he could live among other priests and religious. And it was in this environment, without ostentation, without luxury, that his life came to an end. A choice that summed up his vision of the church: fewer thrones, more service. The Pope's body was laid to rest in a serene manner. The images that circulated showed a man at peace, wearing liturgical vestments with a calm face. Faithful passed before him in silence. Some wept, others made the sign of the cross. Many carried rosaries in their hands, others just empty hands, but full of respect. The wake lasted for days, and each visitor seemed to carry not only a gesture of mourning, but also of gratitude. There was something profound in the way people looked at that body. It wasn't just goodbye to a pope, but to a pastor who walked with them. Meanwhile, voices around the world began to interpret events. Some saw parallels between Francis' last days and the biblical accounts of Christ's passion. Others preferred to keep the tone sober, highlighting his leadership in difficult times. But even among the most skeptical, there was an undeniable recognition. The moment of his death had a symbolic force that could not be ignored. His departure during the octave of Easter, in the exact period in which the Church's liturgy celebrates the first encounters with the resurrected Christ, was seen by many as a sign of an accomplished mission. There were no triumphalist speeches, no hasty declarations of holiness, but the silence with which he was received, the dignity of the rites, and the way in which the faithful fired, indicated that there was someone who had left real marks. Not because of the structures it changed, but because of the consciences it touched. And the memory of that sunny Sunday, with its last public blessing, became even more meaningful in light of his absence. The image of Pope Francis bowing before the crowd, just moments before his final blessing, remains etched in the memories of millions. The gesture was not new, he had done it before. But that Sunday, he carried a different weight. Not only because of the visible state of fragility, but because of the almost mystical synchrony between the gesture of a shepherd who was leaving and the climax of a celebration that recalled the triumph of life over death. The Pope blessed while the Church celebrated the resurrection. And at that moment, without the world even knowing it, his own crossing was near. This coincidence of times provoked a wave of interpretations. For many believers, it was not a simple coincidence, but a divine response, not in the sense of an explicit miracle, but a silent sign of these that do not impose themselves, but that make you think. Christian theology has always recognized that God speaks through events, and that certain moments do not need rational explanations to carry deep meanings. The death of a pope, especially one with the trajectory and symbolism of Francis, in the central days of the Christian faith, became one of those occasions in which the sacred seems to touch human time. The liturgy of the octave of Easter itself seems to dialogue with this event. During these days, the Church proclaims readings that speak of renewed faith, of encounters with the living Christ, of Thomas's unbelief being transformed into worship. These are texts marked by the surprise of life that returns, by the hope that is reborn when everything seemed over. And precisely in this liturgical interval, between the celebration of the resurrection and the resumption of daily life, the pontiff leaves. As if your earthly cycle ended in time, with sacred time. There are those who see this as a kind of final testimony, not verbal, but experiential. Francis, who throughout his pontificate insisted on calling the faithful back to the essential, to the incarnate faith, to care for others, ends his mission exactly when the Church invites its children to renew their commitment to the new life of the resurrected Christ. His death was not marked by speeches, nor by great ceremonies, but by a silence that seemed to dialogue with the liturgy of that time. A silence that, paradoxically, said a lot. Within the biblical tradition, time has always been more than a continuous line. It was seen as a space where God acts. Therefore, festivals, cycles, jubilees, sacred periods were not just ways of organizing the calendar, but occasions of divine intervention. The death of a pope during Holy Week would, from this perspective, be more than an alignment of dates. It would be a revealing moment, where the invisible insinuates itself through what is visible. And even though it cannot be said with certainty that this fact was a sign, it invites a deeper contemplation of what is beyond the apparent. Francis was a pope who lived to bring the spiritual closer of human. He preferred simple gestures, visits to outskirts, meetings with patients and refugees, clear words that did not depend on complicated theologies. His spirituality was expressed in everyday life, in concrete, in touch. Perhaps that is why his death was perceived with such symbolic force, because it was also concrete, close, and at the same time surrounded by a sacred aura. The aura of someone who completed their mission just when the church was celebrating the mystery of Christ's completed mission. This relationship between sacred time and departure is not something exclusive to the figure of the Pope. But in the case of Francisco, his personal and pastoral trajectory amplified this connection. He himself, on several occasions, spoke about his awareness of finitude, about being prepared for when God called him. He didn't make it a drama, but a calm acceptance. And when the moment arrived, it was not marked by urgency, but by a natural closure, like someone handing the mission back into the hands of the Lord. This delivery, silent and at the same time full of meaning, was understood by many as a last homily not spoken, but lived. The way Pope Francis lived and died clearly revealed the essence of his legacy. It was not the major administrative reforms, nor the public debates on sensitive topics that marked his presence, but the way he embodied the role of pastor in a time of profound spiritual fragmentation. He did not shy away from conflicts, but he also did not seek confrontation, preferred being a bridge, even when that meant being criticized by both sides. And when he left during the days that celebrate the victory of life over death, he left a testimony that goes beyond the limits of the position he held. He left a living example of dedication until the end. His leadership was deeply marked by simplicity. He walked among the poor naturally, avoiding protocols that distanced of the people, preferred meals in common refectory to solemn banquets. He spoke of mercy, but not as a concept, but as a practice. He visited prisons, washed inmates' feet, hugged victims forgotten by the headlines. I didn't try to appear holy, I tried to be a presence. Presence of listening, comfort, closeness. And it was this same presence that accompanied him until his last days. There was no spectacle, no acting. His death was consistent with his life, discreet but remarkable, simple but full of meaning. His departure during the octave of Easter led many to revisit his teachings with new eyes. Texts that talked about trust and providence gained new weight. Words that mentioned death as part of the journey of faith were read more carefully. Francisco used to say that one should not be afraid of getting old, nor of dying, because the Christian life is a journey, not a race. And in his last years, this stopped being a speech and became experience. He was vulnerable, not ashamed of his pain, but also without victimhood. He walked with suffering without letting it dominate his identity. In his last public appearance, when offering the Easter blessing, there was no force in the gestures, but there was intention. The look was still the same, firm, compassionate, attentive. He knew that moment could be his last. And even so, or perhaps because of that, he did it with serenity. It was as if he were saying, silently, that his mission was complete and that leaving on Easter days was a final gift. Not as personal glory, but as a sign of communion with what he believed in most, the hope that is born from the cross. Religious leaders, politicians, and ordinary people from different parts of the world expressed gratitude and recognition. But what was most impressive was the tone of the tributes. Little was said about formal achievements or political achievements. The most recurring words were peace, humility, and coherence. This coherence, perhaps, is one of the strongest marks of his life. He did not change the church in its deepest structure, but he helped to rescue something essential: the beauty of faith lived sincerely. Your stooped figure, your shy smile, your patient listening, all of this compose an image that many hold dearly as an image of a man of real faith. The faith he lived was not idealized, but rooted in everyday life. He spoke of the importance of praying for one another, of opening the doors of the church to everyone, of welcoming before judging. In times when so many turn away from spirituality because they feel excluded or not understood, Francisco was a breath of welcome. His way of being pope was not one of superiority, but of proximity. And that's why his death, more than sadness, generated reflection. Because it wasn't just the end of a pontificate. It was the end of a narrative lived with intensity, marked by small but profoundly transformative gestures. The message he left, as he left at such a symbolic moment, invites every person of faith, or even those just watching from the outside, to reconsider what it means to live with purpose. Francisco was not perfect, nor did he wish to appear to be, but his final, silent, and symbolic delivery reinforces the idea that the Christian mission is not about visibility, but about fidelity. And the most eloquent loyalty is the one that remains firm until the last breath, even if few are watching. The shock that followed Pope Francis' death was quiet, profound, and, in many ways, contemplative. There were no outbursts of theatrical emotions, no fiery speeches. The world seemed to enter a state of respectful pause, as if instinctively understanding that something bigger had happened. Perhaps because it was not just the loss of a leader, but the closure of a presence that, in a discreet way, was capable of touching dimensions of the human soul that words and decrees cannot reach. The figure of Francisco, always more inclined to listen than to impose, left a space that will not be easily filled, not because of his position, but because of the way in which he occupied that place. The lines that formed to pay their last respects to his body revealed this emotional connection between the Pope and the people. Men and women of different ages, from different parts of the world, of different beliefs, or even without a declared faith, waited in silence to spend a few seconds in front of a body that was not only being veiled, but honored. What was seen was more than institutional respect. It was gratitude. And this gratitude was expressed without great speeches, as if each look, each sign of the cross, or each tear said something that words could not express. Even after his death, Francisco continued to carry out his pastoral mission. In the way his departure was received, in the moved silence of the faithful, in the reflections he aroused, it is clear that his influence surpassed the borders of the church. He had become a kind of living consciousness of compassion, justice, and hope in dark times. Not for slogans or speeches viral, but because there was authenticity in its delivery. This authenticity, which attracted so much throughout his pontificate, now became even clearer in the way his goodbye was experienced. The question that looms is inevitable. Was his death during Holy Week a sign? A message from God? Faith, by definition, does not offer visible proof or certainty, but she is sensitive to mysteries. And there are mysteries that, even without being explained, cannot be ignored. Francisco's departure during the days when Christians celebrate the victory of light over darkness, of love over hate, of life over death, is one of those realities that seem to surpass chance. This is not about building myths or forcing interpretations, but to notice when the invisible insinuates itself with enough force to not simply be dismissed. Perhaps Francisco's greatest legacy is precisely this: the ability to remind us that faith is not made of mathematical certainties, but of trust in the face of mystery. That the greatness of a life is not in what you achieve, but in what you give. And that death, when lived with meaning, can be an even more eloquent testimony than any sermon. He left at the time when the resurrection is celebrated. And this costume, in itself, is enough to awaken consciousness to something greater. There are lives that end, and there are lives that continue to inspire, even after the end. Francisco seems to inhabit this second category. His departure did not silence his voice, nor did it end his influence. She simply led her to another dimension, where the example remains as a living memory, as a presence that challenges, consoles, and inspires. And, above all, as an invitation to live coherently, serve with humility, and not be afraid to die faithful to what you believe. Whether it was a coincidence or a sign, time will not give a definitive answer. But those who have attentive eyes and an awakened heart may find, in the synchrony between his death and Holy Week, one of those silent messages that God usually sends to the world. Not out of obligation, but out of mercy. As someone who wants to remember, once again, that no life is small when it is lived with love, and that no ending is tragic when it is marked by fidelity. If you value content that deals with faith with seriousness, depth, and meaning, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support makes all the difference. Leave a like and share with those who also seek to understand the signs that cross time and spirit. And, the next video will bring a new perspective that is worth following.